Now, a little bit of psychology, as I promised. So how do criminals think? And we've had a lot of, we've seen a lot of research and a lot of efforts from academics, but also from law enforcement around trying to not just prevent especially youth from becoming criminals online, but also also around educating users on how to prevent, how to actually not becoming victims, and try to avoid the small kind of aspects that criminals take advantage of. So in terms of how criminals perceive risk, or how we all actually perceive risk, based on prospect theory, there are human risky behaviors are underlined by two psychological parameters: the gain and loss, of course, framing, and the probability levels. Like, so for example, what do I have to lose, or what do I have to gain, and what are the possibilities of me gaining or losing that? And of course, based on protection motivation theory, the threat can initiate two cognitive processes: the threat appraisal and coping appraisal. So how significant is the threat? How risky is the threat? And can I actually avoid that risk? Now, if we can apply these theories to both the victim and the offender, and especially here talking about the offenders, risk perception of cybercrime is quite significant, because there are so many factors that actually shape risk perception. We've seen many misconceptions on the severity and punishment of cybercrime. Usually there's a perceived lack of police interest in actually responding to cybercrime, and of course the perception of the likelihood of being detected as low due to that lack of police interest or lack of resources of the police. But also we've seen misconceptions around what is actually a risky or harmful online behavior. And if we think about victims, as I mentioned, there is ambivalence around the potential risk of becoming a victim. Promoting risk in a way that is actually positive, not necessarily negative, can actually change these misconceptions. And of course, if we add on emotion in this equation, usually the emotions evoked around cybercrime is fear, and that alone by itself can lead to specific extreme reactions around cybercrime. Specifically on hackers, we see a strong preference for rational decision-making processes. So we see that hackers who have actually confidence in their ability to conduct successful attacks, they will initiate more hacking attempts, or they will engage in actually specific attack routines or specific routines that will actually yield higher success rates, and the opposite for hackers with less really confidence in their ability to initiate successful attacks. I wanted to mention some also relevant research here that I conducted with Dr. Iting Chua around understanding these perceptions of cyber criminals in terms of what is legal, what is illegal, but also identify whether there's an emotional construct of cybercrime. And of course, the way that cybercrime is perceived from these members of underground forums. And for this research, we actually used a data set from the Cambridge Cybercrime Center, looking at a number of years from 2012 to 2019. As you can see here, I have the details of the number of forums, but also the members of these forums. And we actually conducted NLP analysis because, as you see here, we've had thousands of posts and a large number of forums to work with. However, as you see here, we identified different deviant behaviors: doxing, hacking, e-whoring, phishing, of course, trolling, harassment. Different types of attacks were being mentioned. So it was quite interesting to see how members of underground forums discuss around all these types of behaviors in terms of riskiness and the danger of them actually getting caught. And as you can see here, we looked at biograms and collocations, and here the most prevalent or common biogram was really around getting caught. This was really the most prevalent topic of the discussions among members of underground forums. And of course, around law enforcement and reporting. Here, once again, from the collocations, again, we see a similar pattern. What are the chances of getting caught, the risk of getting caught? These were really the most prevalent discussions. So I've added a number of quotes here coming from these discussions that can actually illustrate kind of the risk perception around cybercrime. And you see here some advice at the first quote: to not get caught, you have to make sure you don't log in from the same IP and make sure to clear regular cookies, basic advice. But also the second quote: you will probably not get caught. So this is really what is being discussed among members. You will probably not get caught if you do this and this. So they share basic information most of the time, or basic steps to avoid getting caught. And as you can see here, around the perception of risk of getting caught, in quote 3, so unless the police have hired under hardware geeks that know what they're doing, I wouldn't be worried. So again, we see a lack of really of any consideration around getting caught. And that maybe explains why cybercrime is becoming so prevalent. And we see more and more youngsters actually joining these groups. In terms of the perception of the criminal justice system, we've seen really similar patterns. As you see here, the cyber police have way worse things to deal with and simply don't care enough to investigate you. There's like a zero risk factor. And similarly about the court system, you can spoof a MAC address and change it. Therefore, it's not even concrete enough to use in court. And of course, this is the case. A large majority of such cases, and even fraud cases, they never end up in court being prosecuted because of a lack of specific information, or because even of lack of resources of law enforcement. And especially when it comes to risk avoidance strategies, as I mentioned, members of underground forums, they share basic steps and information or advice. So if you don't want to get caught, download Hotspot Shield. So information can be very specific or broad. And around the threshold of where, in which occasions will you get caught and in which not. Are you going to get targeted and arrested for ratting? No, probably not, even for more severe cybercrimes. So similarly, I think you get really the idea of the types of discussions we have identified. And when it comes to really the results of that research, we've seen a general optimistic bias of criminals that they will not get caught. But also, as I said, a number of avoidance strategies being discussed, remaining anonymous, the use of VPN, removing information or evidence that would allow for the linking of identities, or even using common sense, really avoiding basic mistakes. And we have actually professional hackers sharing their knowledge or even tools to actually beginners. And that's quite interesting that actually hackers exchange their knowledge and experience. In terms of what is legal and what is illegal, there's a total misunderstanding around this area. So we have actually hackers discussing about hacking video games as not being illegal, but also, for example, selling code for hacking, or online harassment, or cracking social media accounts being illegal. As I mentioned, a mixed perception towards law enforcement agencies. They talk about successful cases and arrests, but also they talk about the lack of resources and lack of focus of law enforcement on low-level hackers. So I talked about the current threat landscape. I talked about the potential risks of IoTs and smart wearable devices. I touched upon the way hackers and criminals think and what really shapes their behavior. And so after all this discussion, I thought it makes sense to bring in some positiveness and actually talk about what we can do, what can governments do, what individuals can do to actually prevent them becoming really the target or the victim of an attack. We've done with risks some work around improving the resilience specifically to ransomware. We've run a workshop back in December where we had actually as participants different stakeholders, from government officials to law enforcement, academics. And actually, although we discussed about the challenges of the public sector, the private sector, different sectors, health sector, again, the discussion was going to the user, the people, the human, as you see here, the weakest link. So it went always towards that discussion, of course, because we're talking about technology being used by employees, by users, by humans. Another aspect that was quite prevalent, talking about the human factor, was of course training, and either organizations are providing training or they should be training employees. And of course, basic steps to actually improve resilience around ransomware is having a backup. That was the most really prevalent kind of advice. But as you see here, culture change was another aspect that came out from the discussion linking to the human factor. I mentioned earlier, especially for SMEs and sole traders, what happens if they're victimized from a ransomware attack or any other type of attack? But especially for a ransomware attack, there comes the time where you have to make a decision. Are we paying? Am I paying the ransom? Am I reporting to the police? And as you see here, there are several factors that actually will go into this complex decision. Such as the criticality of affected data and systems, the availability and integrity of data that are backed up, or are they actually backed up? Are there backups? The cost of the ransom, what is the loss, what is the gain? I mentioned earlier that actually these considerations apply to both the victim and the offender, but also what is the likelihood of successful restoration of data, because no one really can promise that after paying ransom, your data will actually be unlocked and returned to you, because in most of the cases, your data might have been sold already to other hackers, or they will never be returned anyway. And actually, that is quite a difficult decision, especially if we take into consideration smaller enterprises, SMEs, and sole traders. But we have identified a number of advice that actually is basic advice when it comes to defending against ransomware attacks, such as backing up data, having an antivirus, a firewall installed, restrict admin rights on endpoints, keeping commonly exploited third-party applications updated, run risk assessments, simulations, auditing and monitoring. But overall, I think the basis or the kind of background around that is awareness and training for employees, because that can prevent the initial kind of a way of initiating an attack, which, as we saw, is phishing and social engineering. But we identified also a number of key gaps, and hopefully these will become projects that others will look at, or that policy experts will actually look at. Understanding the offenders. I touched upon that a bit, of how offenders think around cybercrime and what can change so that these perceptions and attitudes change. But also around organizational preparedness. A small majority of companies, and usually the large corporations, will have a communication strategy. What do we do in the occasion of a ransomware attack? Who contacts who? What is the next step? What is the second step? And that's why running simulations and exercises is quite important. And of course, responding to the attack, or even reporting, which is a huge challenge for law enforcement at the moment. But also, no one talks about the social impacts and implications of ransomware attacks. Usually, we focus on the financial loss of the victimized organization, for example, rather than the other kinds of implications and impacts. So concluding here, final slide, so that we have some time for discussion, hopefully. I've talked about processes and decision-making, really processes within organizations, which are really needed, even for small enterprises or even down to the sole trader, because having a plan really can minimize the time lost to respond to attacks, but also reporting and sharing knowledge and lessons learned among victimized organizations can again save time and effort. Just like hackers share knowledge and tools, I think this way we can actually bring that thinking and behavior towards those that want to defend against attacks. And of course, security and privacy considerations by design. We need to start thinking about these aspects early on. Not just at the kind of response stage, but also the prevent stage. And of course, cybersecurity awareness raising initiatives are quite necessary at all levels, in all sectors, from the kind of governmental official down to the simple user. So thank you. I hope that was interesting and not really too much for this time of the day.